Imagine someone you love has just been locked in this really brutal, agonizing battle with severe depression.
Right, like months of profound exhaustion.
Exactly. The kind of heaviness that just seems to pull all the air right out of the room. But then suddenly you see them on a Tuesday afternoon and the weight is just gone.
They're calm?
Yeah, they're calm, they're smiling, they seem entirely at peace. And I mean, your immediate human instinct is to just breathe this massive sigh of relief. You think, the storm is finally broken.
You think the new medication worked, or they turned the corner,
Right.
which is exactly what makes that specific phenomenon so incredibly dangerous.
Because that sudden, inexplicable calm is very often not a sign of healing. It's actually the false peace that arrives the exact moment a person makes the final, irrevocable decision to end their own life.
The internal debate is just over. The war in their mind has ceased, and what you are witnessing is not recovery at all.
No, it's the terrifying tranquility of a finished internal negotiation.
It completely upends our fundamental assumptions about what a crisis looks like. I mean, we're conditioned to look for the screaming, the tears, the visible breakdown.
Yeah, the cinematic version of a breakdown.
Exactly. But the reality is that the most lethal stages of psychological suffering are frequently silent, and they are just incredibly deceptive.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to our deep dive. You have this invisible architecture running inside your body right now.
We all do.
Right. I have it. The person serving you coffee this morning has it. Yet despite the fact that every single one of us relies on this internal framework to just, survive, to work, to love it, remains shrouded in this bizarre, suffocating silence.
We are, of course, talking about our mental health.
Exactly.
And for this, we are pulling directly from the clinical insights of Dr. Ferris W. Corbett. Specifically, we're looking at a pretty staggering segment of his health talk transcripts titled The Silent Struggle.
And what I love about the source material is that it completely rejects that passive, superficial approach to mental health. Right.
Because, let's be honest, we've all seen the generic mental health awareness campaigns.
Oh, yeah. The pastel graphics on social media.
Exactly. A little infographic and a polite reminder to check on your friends. But awareness without actionable understanding is essentially useless.
It really is.
Knowing that a rip current exists doesn't help you survive if you're already caught in one, right? Not if nobody ever taught you how to swim parallel to the shore.
That's a great way to put it.
So our mission for this deep dive is to basically tear down the drywall and look at the actual plumbing and electrical wiring of human psychology. Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to explore the raw biological mechanics of trauma.
We'll dissect the societal crosshairs that are targeting specific demographics right now.
Plus, we need to learn how to identify those completely counterintuitive warning signs of a true crisis.
And finally, map out the physiological reality of what recovery actually requires.
Yes. But to do all of that, I feel like we have to start by completely demolishing a century-old medical misconception. We definitely do. For generations, the dominant psychiatric and medical model defined mental health purely by negative space.
By what wasn't there.
Exactly. By what wasn't there.
Okay, wait, I think I know where you're going with this. It's the idea that, well, if I don't have a catastrophic diagnosable illness, then by default, I must be perfectly healthy.
That's it. The historical framework was strictly binary. You either met the criteria for a severe clinical psychiatric disorder, or you were just slapped with a clean bill of health.
You're either crazy or you're fine.
Right, but that is a catastrophic misunderstanding of human biology. Dr. Corbett's material emphasizes that mental health is not just an absence, it's an active dynamic state.
It's a presence.
Yes, it is the active presence of psychological, emotional, and social well-being. It's your neurological resilience. It's literally your capacity for intimacy.
So, it's entirely possible to be completely free of a clinical diagnosis, yet have a mental health baseline that is just completely deteriorating behind the scenes.
Right.
I used to think of this like a car engine, right? Like, as long as it isn't smoking on the side of the highway, it's quote-unquote fine. But honestly, thinking about what we're discussing now, that analogy feels a bit too rigid.
How so?
Well, a car engine is a closed mechanical system. You replace a part, it works. The human mind is something else entirely.
Yeah, a much better way to conceptualize it is by looking at structural engineering. Think about something like a suspension bridge.
Okay, a bridge?
Right, because a suspension bridge isn't rigid. It's entirely dependent on this delicate, dynamic balance of tension and compression.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
So the bridge isn't actively collapsing into the river, which would be the acute crisis, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's structurally sound.
Precisely. The bridge might be standing today, but what if the steel cables are slowly corroding from salt in the air?
Or microfractures in the concrete.
Exactly. What if those fractures are expanding every single time a heavy truck drives over it? What if the foundational pylons underwater are shifting in the current?
You can drive over that bridge every single day and think it's perfectly safe simply because it hasn't fallen down yet.
Right. But its capacity to absorb a shock, say an earthquake, or in human terms, a sudden job loss, a divorce, maybe a global pandemic, its capacity to handle that is entirely compromised.
So mental health is the ongoing maintenance of that structural tension.
Exactly.
That is a brilliant shift in perspective. And frankly, we desperately need that shift because the structural integrity of our society is buckling under an immense amount of weight right now.
It really is.
The source material pulls data from the National Institute of Mental Health showing that nearly 1 in 5 adults in the United States experiences mental illness each year.
1 in 5.
Millions upon millions of people. But
Yeah.
again, human brains are notoriously terrible at processing large numbers.
Yeah, tens of millions is just an abstraction. It washes right over you.
It becomes much more terrifying when you apply it to your immediate environment, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because 1 in 5 means if you are sitting at a conference table with 10 people, 2 of them are actively navigating a clinical condition.
It's the pilot flying your plane. It's the teacher in your kid's classroom. It's literally the person smiling the hardest at the neighborhood barbecue.
And the spectrum of what they're dealing with is just vast.
We're talking about generalized anxiety disorder, which, by the way, is not just feeling nervous about a test.
No, it's a constant biological hum of dread.
Right. Or it's major depressive disorder, which is this profound chemical hijacking of the spirit. Not to mention bipolar disorder, personality disorders, and trauma-related conditions.
And while that 20% average applies to the general population, the burden of this crisis is not distributed equally at all.
No, certain structural pillars are bearing a disproportionate amount of the load.
Which brings us perfectly into the demographics, because when you look at Dr. Corbett's text, it specifically isolates 3 high-risk groups.
Young adults between 18 and 25, women and men, particularly Black men and men of color.
And what strikes me as so fascinating here is that the mechanism of injury for each of these groups is completely different.
Let's start with the first group, the young adults, 18 to 25. Historically, this is always a volatile age, right?
Sure, you're separating from your family of origin, you're building an identity.
But Dr. Corbett highlights something totally unique to this specific generation right now. This epidemic of crushing loneliness despite unprecedented digital connection.
Yeah, to really understand why this generation is fracturing, you have to look at the intersection of evolutionary biology and modern economics.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, the prefrontal cortex of the human brain, the area that's responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, emotional regulation, it isn't fully myelinated or insulated until roughly age 25.
So their neurological shock absorbers are essentially still under construction.
Exactly. Now take that biologically vulnerable brain and just drop it into the modern economic meat grinder.
Right. Stagnant wages, insurmountable student debt.
A housing market that completely locks them out of foundational stability. They are navigating an environment of intense, constant scarcity.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second. Because every generation faces economic hardship, right? The greatest generation went through the Great Depression and World War II.
That's true.
So why is this specific demographic uniquely paralyzed by it right now?
Yeah.
Is it really just the digital aspect making it worse?
It is the specific nature of the digital aspect. Look, we evolved to live in small tribal communities of maybe 150 people max.
Right, Dunbar's number.
Yes. In that environment, you only had to compare yourself to the local population. Maybe you weren't the fastest runner, but hey, you were the best at foraging. You had a distinct, valuable role.
You belonged.
You belonged. But today, an 18-year-old opens an app on their phone and their brain is instantly subjected to a global, algorithmically optimized comparison trap.
They aren't competing with the kid down the street anymore.
No, they're competing with the top 0.1% of the entire human population.
So their baseline for what constitutes normal is just completely warped.
Entirely. They are constantly exposed to billionaires, supermodels, and teenage prodigies 24 hours a day.
And the brain just can't process that scale, can it?
It can't. The brain's dopamine and cortisol systems cannot distinguish between physical inadequacy in a hunter-gatherer tribe, which literally meant death, and digital inadequacy on a social media feed.
Oh, wow. So the algorithm is actually designed to exploit that human desire for social hierarchy.
Precisely. It feeds them a constant stream of information, proving that they are falling behind, that they are failing, and that they are isolated.
Even if they have thousands of followers.
You can have thousands of followers and absolutely zero intimacy. It's the illusion of community without the safety net of one.
That makes total sense. The biological hardware just cannot handle the digital software.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
Okay, so let's look at the second demographic highlighted in the text. Women. And the statistics here are pretty grim. Women are diagnosed with depression at significantly higher rates.
They are.
And I think the initial instinct for a lot of people is to point strictly to biology, right? Like hormonal transitions, pregnancy, the postpartum period.
Well, the endocrine system is certainly a massive factor. I mean, the rapid fluctuation of estrogen and progesterone directly impacts the synthesis of serotonin and dopamine in the brain.
Sure.
And the physical drop in hormones postpartum is one of the most violent chemical shifts a human body can experience. But to reduce female depression to merely a hormonal issue is incredibly reductive.
Right, because the source material explicitly pivots away from just the biology and zeroes in on the environmental burdens.
Yes, things like caregiver fatigue.
And this massive concept that I really want us to dissect today, emotional labor.
Emotional labor is perhaps the most insidious, invisible stressor in modern society.
I hear that term used constantly, but I feel like it often gets watered down to just mean, doing chores.
It gets misused a lot, yeah.
So let me try to define it based on the text, and you tell me if I'm hitting the mark. Emotional labor isn't about physically washing the dishes. It's the invisible cognitive load of being the project manager for an entire family's existence.
Yes.
It's the mental spreadsheet that never closes.
That is a very accurate starting point.
It's knowing that the toddler needs new shoes next month, remembering that your partner's mother is having a biopsy on Thursday, so you really need to send flowers.
Noticing that the milk is low.
Yeah, and constantly adjusting your own tone and behavior to manage the emotional temperature of the household. It is anticipatory exhaustion.
You've nailed the cognitive aspect completely. But the psychological toll really comes from the fact that this labor is entirely unquantifiable, uncompensated, and largely invisible.
Nobody sees it happening.
Right. When you run a marathon, people see you run, they hand you water, they give you a medal at the finish line.
But when you manage the emotional equilibrium of 5 different humans while simultaneously navigating a full-time career,
society just calls that being a good mother or being a supportive wife.
And when you are constantly hyper-attuned to the needs of everyone else around you, your own internal check engine light just gets completely ignored.
Precisely. The depression we see in these cases is frequently not a spontaneous chemical imbalance at all. It is a biological mutiny.
A biological mutiny.
Yeah. The nervous system becomes so depleted by the sheer volume of continuous low-grade anticipatory stress that the body literally forces a shutdown.
Wow.
Depression becomes the only mechanism the body has left to stop the expenditure of energy.
The body orchestrates a shutdown just to save itself from the cognitive load. That is wild.
That's survival.
And that perfectly mirrors what happens with the third demographic the source highlights. Men, with a specific focus on Black men and men of color, because their socialization creates a completely different kind of biological mutiny.
It does. From the moment they are children, boys, particularly in marginalized communities where physical safety is often very fragile, are indoctrinated into an incredibly rigid, unforgiving definition of masculinity.
The mandates are clear, right? Be strong, be stoic, man up.
Do not show fear. Do not show sadness.
Vulnerability is literally equated with physical danger.
Yes. But here's the biological reality. You cannot legislate away an emotion.
Right.
You can tell a man to swallow his grief, but the cortisol flooding his system still exists. The accelerated heart rate still exists. The allostatic load, the physical wear and tear on the body from chronic stress, it continues to compound.
So what happens to all that kinetic emotional energy? It has to go somewhere, right? It can't just evaporate.
It doesn't evaporate, it transmutes. And this is a vital psychological concept. When a human being experiences a profound, unacceptable emotion like terror or agonizing sadness, and their cultural programming forbids them from expressing it, the brain will subconsciously convert that emotion into one that is culturally acceptable.
And for many men, the only socially sanctioned emotion is anger.
Exactly. Anger looks like power. Anger looks like control.
So a man who is experiencing crushing clinical depression might not look sad at all. He looks enraged.
Exactly. The sadness mutates into rage. Or it mutates into profound isolation.
He just withdraws entirely.
Because the cognitive dissonance of feeling broken while pretending to be unbreakable is just too exhausting. Or, most dangerously, it mutates into substance use.
Alcohol and narcotics.
They become the only available anesthetics to quiet a nervous system that is screaming for help. This is exactly what Dr. Corbett means by emotional shutdown. It creates an impenetrable wall of silence.
It is absolute tragedy by design.
Yeah.
And when you look at all of these groups, the young adult paralyzed by algorithmic comparison, the woman suffocating under the invisible weight of emotional labor, the man drinking himself to death because he was taught that crying was a failure, all of these suppressed chronic pressures eventually lead us to the exact same biological destination.
Yes, they do.
They all crash headfirst into trauma.
And this requires a massive recalculation of how we even define trauma.
Right, because for the better part of a century, the medical establishment viewed post-traumatic stress disorder through a highly specific, very narrow lens.
It was shell shock. It was considered the exclusive domain of combat veterans.
And to be clear, the source material absolutely acknowledges the profound impact of combat trauma. But Dr. Corbett's transcripts basically blow the doors off that limited definition.
Because trauma is not defined by the objective severity of the event. It is defined by the nervous system's subjective inability to process the event.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. The text points out that trauma lives in survivors of abuse, yes, but it also lives in emergency room nurses who spend years intubating patients during a pandemic.
Or children who grow up in neighborhoods where the sound of gunfire is just normalized.
Right, meaning their baseline expectation is violence. It lives in individuals who have survived religious and spiritual manipulation.
I really want to dig into the biology of this. Because when people hear the word trauma, they still tend to think of it as just a bad memory, like a psychological ghost.
Just a bad dream from the past.
Yeah. But the source material is explicitly clear that trauma physically alters the architecture of the brain. So let's talk about the amygdala. And correct me if my understanding here is too simplistic. The amygdala is this tiny almond-shaped cluster of nuclei deep in the temporal lobe. It is essentially our evolutionary smoke detector.
That's exactly what it is.
If I'm walking through the woods and I see a stick that looks like a snake, my amygdala fires before my visual cortex even has time to consciously process what I'm actually looking at.
That is exactly right. The amygdala initiates the HPA axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Okay.
It sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus, which acts like a command center. This triggers a massive cascade of adrenaline and cortisol directly into your bloodstream.
Your heart rate violently accelerates to pump oxygen to your muscles. Your pupils dilate to take in more light.
Your pain receptors are temporarily dampened. You are instantly shifted into fight, flight, or freeze. And this entire process happens in milliseconds. It bypasses the prefrontal cortex, your logical brain, entirely.
Because if you pause to logically analyze whether the snake is poisonous, you get bitten. So the system works. It keeps us alive. But what happens when trauma enters the equation?
Well, in a healthy nervous system, once you realize the snake is just a stick, the parasympathetic nervous system engages. It acts as the brakes.
Okay, so you calm down.
Right. The cortisol recedes, the heart rate drops, and your body returns to homeostasis. But when a person experiences severe trauma, especially chronic repeated trauma, where they are trapped without agency, that braking system fails.
The brakes just stop working.
Basically. The excessive continuous flooding of cortisol actually damages the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain responsible for time-stamping memories.
Hey, time-stamping memories, what does that mean?
It means your brain loses the ability to file the traumatic memory into the past.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The amygdala becomes hypersensitized and physically enlarged. It gets permanently stuck in the on position. So the brain literally believes that the traumatic event is not something that happened years ago, but something that is constantly happening right now.
That is terrifying. It's like living inside a house where the smoke detector goes off every single time you turn on a light switch or take a hot shower or just breathe too heavily.
And you can't take the batteries out.
The siren is deafening, it's 24 hours a day, and your body is constantly reacting as if the roof is caving in, but all you were doing is sitting on your couch trying to read a book.
And the physiological exhaustion of living in a perpetual state of mortal peril is just unimaginable. This explains the specific symptoms outlined in the text.
Like flashbacks.
Right. Flashbacks aren't just remembering a bad day. They are the brain hallucinating the sensory experience of the trauma because the hippocampus failed to file it away.
And hypervigilance.
Hypervigilance is the exhaustion of sitting in a restaurant and constantly monitoring the exits, analyzing the micro-expressions of the waiter, just waiting for the attack.
And the text also brings up emotional numbness, which always felt contradictory to me. I mean, if your alarm system is blasting, how can you be numb?
Because the human nervous system is not a limitless battery. If you run a high-voltage current through a standard wire for long enough, the breaker trips to prevent a fire. Emotional numbness dissociation is the nervous system tripping the breaker.
It just shuts down.
The brain simply cannot sustain the metabolic cost of constant terror, so it shuts down the capacity to feel anything at all. No joy, no connection, no pain, just a void.
Which leads to one of the most chilling lines in the entire transcript. Because society has this very cinematic idea of what trauma looks like. We picture someone rocking back and forth in a corner or screaming.
But Dr. Corbett notes that sometimes trauma looks entirely different.
He says sometimes trauma looks like the person who is always smiling, always serving, but never resting.
The high-functioning trauma response, we call it fawning or overfunctioning, and it is incredibly dangerous because our society aggressively rewards it.
We don't call it trauma. We call it a strong work ethic. We call them the reliable one, the strong friend.
Precisely. But internally, that relentless forward motion is a survival strategy.
Because if they stop
working, if they sit alone in a quiet room, the noise of the unresolved trauma catches up to them. The cortisol spikes. So they run.
They volunteer for every committee. They work 80-hour weeks.
They obsessively fix other people's problems because it provides a socially acceptable distraction from their own burning house.
But you cannot outrun your own biology indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, the structural tension fails, the cables snap.
Yes.
And when that internal alarm rings for months or years without relief, a person becomes desperate for any possible way to turn the siren off. Which brings us to the hardest, heaviest reality of this deep dive.
The mechanics of suicide.
The source material does not flinch from this. Suicide is a leading cause of death among young adults and adolescents. And the profound heartbreak embedded in Dr. Corbett's transcripts is the realization that these tragedies do not happen in a vacuum.
There are almost always warning signs.
But because society is entirely illiterate when it comes to the language of profound despair, we miss them.
We have to learn this language. The text isolates specific behavioral shifts that indicate imminent danger. One of the most critical is when an individual starts talking about feeling like a burden.
Let's pause on that, because saying I feel like a burden is vastly different from saying I am sad. What is the cognitive mechanism happening there?
What's fascinating here is a concept developed in suicidology by Dr. Thomas Joner called the interpersonal theory of suicide. It posits that the desire to die is born from two highly specific psychological states occurring simultaneously.
Which are?
Thwarted belongingness, the feeling of utter isolation and perceived burdensomeness. The illness essentially creates a localized psychosis.
It tricks them.
Meticulously. It builds a logical argument in the victim's mind that their existence is actively, tangibly harming the people they love. They convince themselves that their family would be financially, emotionally, and practically better off if they were dead.
So in their warped reality, they are not acting out of selfishness. They believe they are committing an act of heroic self-sacrifice to save their family from themselves.
Exactly. It is a fatal distortion of love, and this directly fuels the next warning sign: withdrawing from relationships and giving away prized possessions.
Because if you believe you are a toxin, you isolate yourself to stop poisoning the people around you. You tie up loose ends to minimize the collateral damage of your departure.
And then there is the warning sign we discussed at the very top of the show: the sudden, inexplicable calm.
The moment the war ends, because the decision has been made.
Society misinterprets that calm as recovery, which removes the urgency just when the danger is absolutely critical, which is why passive observation is completely insufficient. We have to intervene actively, disrupting that psychological loop.
And the text tells us exactly how to do that, but it goes against every polite social instinct we possess. The direct question.
Yes.
Dr. Corbett explicitly instructs us to ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Or are you thinking about suicide? And I have to admit, the first time I heard this advice years ago, my immediate reaction was pure fear.
The instinctual pushback is always, if I say the word suicide out loud to someone who is just really depressed, aren't I going to plant the seed? Won't I give them the idea?
Right.
This is perhaps the most heavily researched caution in the entire field of mental health intervention, and the data is completely unequivocally definitive. Asking someone directly about suicide never plants the idea in their head.
It is biologically and psychologically impossible to trigger a suicide just by asking the question.
Exactly. If the person is not suicidal, they will simply tell you no. They might be slightly taken aback, but they will not suddenly develop a plan.
But if they are?
If they are suicidal, you have to understand their internal landscape. They are trapped in an agonizing, solitary confinement. They believe they are carrying an unspeakable, monstrous secret.
And when you look them in the eye and ask the direct question, you shatter that isolation. You prove to them that their pain is visible. You prove that you are not terrified of the darkest corners of their mind.
By naming the monster, you strip it of its power. You aren't planting a seed. You are opening a pressure valve. You are giving them permission to finally drop the mask and exhale.
And sometimes the simple act of sharing the cognitive load of that secret is enough to disrupt the momentum of the plan.
Absolutely.
This is the moment where we stop talking about theory and provide the actual lifeline. The source material highlights this, and it is the most important thing we will say today.
Yes. Listen closely.
If you are listening to this right now, in your car or in your kitchen, and you are terrified by the weight you are carrying, or if you're looking at someone you love and your gut is screaming that they are in danger, the resource is the 988 Suicide Crisis Lifeline. Call 988. Text 988. It is 24/7.
And you do not have to be standing on a literal ledge to call. You can call if you just don't know how to survive the next 10 minutes. There are trained crisis counselors whose sole objective is to help you regulate your nervous system and keep you safe.
The gravity of this is immense. You can physically feel the tension when discussing these realities. I mean, let's just take a breath.
Yeah.
And one of the things I deeply appreciate about Dr. Corbett's approach in the source material is that he doesn't just bulldoze past this heaviness. He implements what he calls a trauma-informed pause.
It's an acknowledgement that we are not just floating brains. We are deeply interconnected biological organisms, and sometimes the body needs to be convinced that it is safe before the mind can process anything else.
So we are going to do an exercise in somatic healing. So soma being the Greek word for body. And I want to dig into the why here before we do the what. Why do we need to ground the body? Why can't I just logically tell my brain to calm down?
Because of the hierarchy of the nervous system. As we discussed earlier, an amygdala hijacking happens beneath the level of conscious thought.
It's automatic.
Right, it is bottom-up processing. The physical survival mechanisms take over. You cannot use top-down processing logic and reason to talk your way out of a physiological cascade of adrenaline.
It's like trying to put out a forest fire by reading a book about water.
That is the perfect analogy. You have to speak the language of the nervous system, which is sensory data.
So the text provides the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding exercise. It forces the brain to process real-time, undeniable physical evidence of safety. I want us to actually do this right now.
I think we should.
If you're listening, don't skip forward. Participate. Wherever you are, I want you to pull your mind out of the agonizing past and pull it back from the terrifying future and anchor it right here in this exact second.
We start with the visual cortex.
Look around your environment and find 5 things you can clearly see. Name them silently. The texture of the steering wheel, the grain of the wood on the desk, a cloud through the window, the color of your own shoes, a shadow on the wall. Force your eyes to track the physical boundaries of the room.
Now, shift your sensory input. Find 4 things you can actively feel. Run your thumb over the cool glass of your phone screen. Notice the pressure of the chair against your back. Feel the fabric of your shirt. Wiggle your toes and feel the resistance of the floor. You are establishing the physical perimeter of your own body.
Next, the auditory system. Listen closely and identify 3 distinct sounds. Listen past the sound of my voice. Can you hear the hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of a car passing, the faint rhythm of your own breathing?
Now engage your olfactory system. 2 things you can smell. This requires deep, intentional inhalation, the lingering scent of coffee, the smell of rain or dust outside.
And finally, one thing you can taste. Even if it's just the lingering taste of mint toothpaste or the metallic tang of a sip of water.
Notice what is happening in your chest right now. Notice your respiratory rate. Notice the tension in your jaw.
It actually feels like the physical gravity in the room changes. The
Yeah.
spinning stops. But biologically, what just happened?
By sequentially forcing your brain to process 5 different streams of sensory data sight, touch, sound, smell, taste, you essentially overloaded the amygdala's capacity to maintain the panic loop.
You distracted it with reality.
Exactly. The sensory data flooded into the brain, proving unequivocally that there is no immediate physical threat. There is no tiger. This activates the vagus nerve, which runs from your brainstem down into your abdomen.
And the vagus nerve acts like the brake pedal.
Yes, it signals the parasympathetic nervous system to release acetylcholine, which rapidly drops your heart rate and ceases the production of cortisol.
Your body deserves safety too. That is a breathtaking line from the text.
It's profound.
So if we understand the biology of trauma, if we can recognize the warning signs of collapse, and if we literally possess tools to regulate our nervous system, we arrive at the most frustrating paradox of this entire conversation.
Why do so many people refuse the help?
Exactly. Why do millions suffer in silence, refusing to ask for the lifeline?
The source material identifies the absolute greatest barrier to recovery, and it is not a lack of medication or a lack of therapists. It is stigma. It is the toxic bias of our society.
Dr. Corbett highlights the specific messaging that acts as a roadblock. People finally work up the courage to admit they are drowning, and society tells them, you're just being weak. Real men don't cry. Just think more positive thoughts. Pray harder. You just don't have enough faith.
These aren't just unhelpful platitudes. They are psychologically lethal. Because what they do is take a genuine physiological crisis of the brain and they reframe it as a moral failure or a defect of character.
This double standard drives me absolutely insane. It is a remnant of mind-body dualism, right? Like going back to Descartes in the 1600s, this idea that physical body is a machine, but the mind is some ethereal, mystical spirit completely detached from biology. If you were walking down the street and you get hit by a bus and suffer a compound fracture of your femur, you were taken to the hospital. Your leg is visibly broken. Literally nobody stands over your hospital bed and says, if you just meditated more, your bone would fuse back together. Nobody says, you clearly just didn't pray hard enough to prevent that fracture.
Right. We don't accuse type 1 diabetics of lacking the moral fortitude to produce insulin. We recognize that the pancreas is an organ that has malfunctioned, and we provide synthetic insulin to keep the patient alive.
Exactly. But the absolute second, the organ that malfunctions is the brain, which, by the way, is the most complex, energy-intensive biological structure in the known universe. We completely abandon all medical science and scientific logic. We tell people with a severe neurotransmitter deficiency to just try harder not to be sick.
And this brings us to the incredibly complex intersection of mental health and religion. Dr. Corbett's transcripts navigate this with incredible nuance, because faith itself is a duality. For millions of people, faith is the ultimate protective factor. It provides a profound sense of cosmic meaning, a resilient community structure, and deep emotional comfort. True faith and medical science are not adversaries.
They aren't mutually exclusive. You don't have to choose between God and a therapist.
Precisely. As the text suggests, faith comforts the soul, but clinical treatment supports the mind and the physical body. Acknowledging that God provided us with the capacity to understand neurobiology, to develop cognitive therapies, and to synthesize stabilizing medications is entirely consistent with a robust faith.
Seeking therapy is no more a lack of faith than wearing glasses to correct a vision deficit.
Beautifully said.
However, the text takes a very brave turn here. Because while faith is a shield for many, Dr. Corbett acknowledges that for some individuals, the religious institution itself was the weapon.
The concept of spiritual trauma, the text states, for some of us, religion wasn't always healing. Sometimes religion became part of the trauma.
We have to unpack that. Because religious trauma is often dismissed, but it operates on the exact same biological pathways as physical abuse.
It does. When a religious environment utilizes the fear of eternal damnation, intense shame, or the threat of absolute social ostracization to enforce control, it induces a state of chronic, unresolvable terror in the nervous system.
Wow.
The individual is taught that their core identity is inherently flawed and loathsome. This creates crippling perfectionism, severe anxiety disorders, and profound depression. And the tragedy is compounded because the very institution they are told to seek out for healing is the source of the injury.
It's like being poisoned, and the only doctor in town is the one who gave you the poison. We have to validate that reality. We have to treat mental health with the exact same actionable medical rigor that we apply to physical health, regardless of the cultural or spiritual context.
Absolutely.
Which brings us, finally, to the architecture of recovery. We've mapped the damage. How do we actually rebuild the bridge?
Dr. Corbett outlines a comprehensive framework of clinical and daily tools, beginning with formal therapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT.
Let's strip away the clinical jargon for a second. What is actually happening in a CBT session? Because it's not just lying on a couch talking about your childhood, right?
Not at all. CBT is rooted in the concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to physically reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. There is a foundational rule in neuroscience called Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together wire together.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Trauma and depression create deeply entrenched, highly efficient neural pathways of negative thought. For instance, a minor failure occurs at work. The entrenched pathway instantly fires the thought, I am incompetent, I will be fired, my life is over. This triggers profound anxiety, which leads to isolation.
So the pathway is like a deeply rutted dirt road. The thought automatically falls into the rut.
Exactly. CBT teaches the patient to intercept that thought before the emotional cascade begins. You identify the cognitive distortion, evaluate the actual evidence, and consciously force the brain to formulate a realistic alternative.
Like, I made a mistake, but my overall performance is strong.
Yes. Initially, this requires immense cognitive effort. It is literally biological friction. But every time you force the thought down the new, healthier pathway, you strengthen those synapses and weaken the old, destructive ones. You are biologically rewiring the brain.
And the PBT.
DBT was originally developed for individuals with extreme emotional dysregulation. It builds on CBT but adds a massive focus on distress tolerance and radical acceptance.
So it's not just changing the thought.
Right. It doesn't just teach you to change your thoughts. It teaches you how to sit inside a raging emotional firestorm without turning to self-destructive behaviors to escape the heat. It teaches you how to ride the wave.
But doing that intensive cognitive work requires a certain baseline of stability, which is where the next tool comes in, medication. And I want to highlight exactly how the text frames this because it destroys the stigma so beautifully.
It really does.
The text points out that medication does not change who you are. It creates enough stability for the healing work to begin.
There is a massive societal fear that antidepressants, SSRIs, or anti-anxiety medications will lobotomize your personality or turn you into an unfeeling zombie.
That is exactly what kept me from understanding it for years.
Yeah.
Think of it again like our bridge analogy, or better yet, a crumbling historic building.
Okay.
The foundation's cracked, the mortar's dissolving, the walls are bowing. If you send the masons in to do the deep restorative work, the building is so unstable it might collapse on them. So, you bring in heavy steel scaffolding. You bolt it to the outside of the structure.
The scaffolding doesn't cure the foundation. It doesn't replace the bricks.
Right. But it holds the entire structure completely still. It absorbs the shock so that the workers, the CBT, the DBT, the deep trauma processing, can safely get inside the building and do the excruciatingly hard work of rebuilding the walls.
That's a great analogy.
Psychiatric medication is the scaffolding. It regulates the neurochemistry. It stops the amygdala from screaming long enough for your prefrontal cortex to come back online and participate in therapy.
Yes.
And maybe, after 2 years of hard work, you take the scaffolding down. Or maybe you realize your brain simply needs that structural support permanently, so you leave it up. Either way, it is a brilliant feat of engineering, not a moral failure.
That is the perfect way to understand it. And alongside the clinical tools, the text emphasizes the daily maintenance required to keep the structure sound. Mindfulness, which we practice with the sensory grounding.
Right.
Journaling, which is vital because it utilizes the language centers of the brain to process chaotic emotional energy into linear, logical narratives.
You are forcibly evicting the rumination from your head and trapping it on the paper.
Yes. And perhaps most importantly, boundaries. This goes directly back to the women suffering under emotional labor and the strong friends fawning their way through trauma.
You can't heal if you keep giving away your energy.
You cannot heal a burnt-out nervous system if you are continuously allowing your energy to be extracted by the demands of others. No is a complete sentence.
And a digital detox to break the comparison trap. You have to aggressively curate your algorithmic inputs. If a platform is continuously sending you cortisol spikes by showing you an impossible standard of living, you have to cut the cord.
It is about reclaiming absolute sovereignty over your own psychological ecosystem.
When you pull all of this together, the therapy, the scaffolding of medication, the aggressive boundary setting, the nervous system regulation, it becomes clear that mental health is not some mystical, unachievable state. It is a daily, mechanical practice.
And it's a practice that belongs to everyone.
The exhausted mother, the stoic father, the burnt-out nurse, the struggling student. Because having a fragile nervous system doesn't make you broken. It just makes you human.
If the listener takes absolutely nothing else from this hour, they must understand this paradigm shift. Mental health is a tangible, biological reality. It is the structural integrity of your internal bridge. It requires maintenance, it requires respect, and it requires honesty.
To you, the person listening to this right now, we have traversed an incredible amount of territory today. We've moved from the ancient biology of the amygdala to the modern toxicity of the digital world, through the mechanics of trauma, the agonizing realities of crisis, and the literal rewiring of the brain in recovery.
We want to echo Dr. Corbett's direct, unvarnished message to you from the source text.
If you are in the dark right now, if you feel like the structure is failing, hear this. Your pain is real.
Yeah.
It is biologically valid. Your story matters. And your life holds an absolute, irreplaceable gravity in this world.
And we have an immediate call to action for you, drawn directly from the text. When the audio on this deep dive fades out, we want you to check on your strong friend. Check on the project manager of your family. Check on the person who, when you ask how they are, always reflexively says, "I'm good, I'm just busy." Do not accept the superficial answer. Ask a real question and be prepared to hold the weight of a real answer.
Because they might be fighting a solitary war simply because they think society requires them to.
Yeah.
And I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to sit with as you go about the rest of your day. We spent this entire deep dive analyzing how society actively conditions us to hide our psychological fractures.
We're trained to smile through the exhaustion.
To put on the armor? To pretend the bridge isn't swaying in the wind? But think for just a moment about the sheer monumental volume of metabolic and psychological energy it takes to maintain that disguise every single hour of every single day. The exhausting performance of fine. What could you build? What kind of profound, authentic intimacy could you experience? What kind of peace could you achieve if you took all the massive energy you currently spend hiding your silent struggle and invested it entirely into asking for help?
That is the moment the healing actually begins, the moment you drop the heavy armor.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dr. Corbett's material. We took the time to tear down these walls and look at the foundation today because your health, the seen, the unseen, the biology, and the spirit truly matters. Until next time.